Today's session is called Building Accessible Forms, and I've got with me Robin Christopherson. Robin, can you tell me about what your role is at AbilityNet, and in particular mention anything related to your work on accessibility?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Robin Christopherson. I'm Head of Digital Inclusion at AbilityNet. Originally, I was an assessor, so I know all about the assistive technologies and software, etc., that people use. And then I founded the accessibility consultancy team back in 2002 and managed that for several years. And now I have more of an advocacy, public speaking role, and have great pleasure in doing these webinars along with Mark.
Great, thank you. And I'm Mark Walker. I'm the marketing manager for AbilityNet. I host these webinars for AbilityNet. So today's topic is building accessible forms. We're going to look briefly at why you would build accessible forms and what you have to do. Mainly today we're going to be talking about what you need to do to build them. The why you would do it, obviously for some people, it's basically about accessibility, simply making sure that your digital services, your website, your app is as accessible as possible, and a form can often be a key part of making your site accessible. There's some often thorny problems that will come up when you test it and discover what you need to do to make it accessible. You may be doing that because of legal compliance issues. You may be doing it because you're trying to make your site as usable as possible and you recognize the link to good accessibility. You may be doing it because you see the social value of that, of making your website as usable as possible for as many people as possible. But in a commercial sense, there's a particular reason, I think, is that when you look around at the advice and information to do with forms, then very often they're seen as being a key part of why people don't complete a purchase or don't register for something or don't join in with something. So really, in terms of connecting with your customers or your service users, a form can be a key place where they abandon that journey, the user journey towards your service. And so anything you can do to make the form easier to use, more accessible, less broken, will help increase your take-up rates. And then that's part of really delivering a more effective user experience. When we go through this stuff today, you'll see that a lot of it is just thinking about it from the user's point of view, getting the information clear, making sure that they understand where they are in the process, making it as easy to use as possible. And clearly that's good, that will add value across the whole piece of your user experience or their experience of your service. So we're going to talk about three things in particular. One is make sure the instructions are clear, that where you think you understand what you're asking for, make sure that the users actually understand that as well. How you handle errors, because that can be a key part of the process that just gets in the way of somebody finishing. They don't really know what it is they've done wrong. They don't really know what they're meant to do about it, and so they just stop and wander off somewhere else. And then a third area, looking at mobile, and in particular forms, filling in or using forms on a mobile, and probably suggesting that's as good a place as any to start this because of the constraints and the issues around using a mobile and filling in a form on a mobile. Brief bit of background about AbilityNet. We're a charity. We provide services to a whole range of different businesses that they pay for. We use surpluses from that to deliver free services to a number of people, particularly disabled people in their homes. We have services for workplaces. We have services for students. We also have digital accessibility services looking at testing and auditing and providing advice to people such as Barclays, the FA, BT and others to ensure that their services are as accessible as possible. We have free tools like My Computer My Way, which provides advice on how to make your smartphone or your laptop or your tablet accessible to you. Lots of fact sheets on our sites and free resources. So let's get started. The first one is instructions. You know what that form field means, but do your users? Are they clear about what you're asking from them? And have they been set up in the process as a whole to know that really a picture of what's going to happen as they start going through the form? This will have an impact on accessibility and will directly, because of that, have an impact on usability. And these two things are very clearly linked. You need to set expectations. We're going to talk about mandatory fields, the optional fields on a form, how you position the labels, the formats, that you want people to put the information into, the use of language, and looking at confirmation before actually sending or submitting information. So setting expectations. It's got a very clear list of bullet points here about what you need to be able to get started. How many screens does it have? It might be a very long form. It may be it may take a little bit of time. You may need somebody to think, I've got to settle down and do this. There are accessibility considerations here, of course, but to some extent this is just good usability. About getting the form, kicking it off in the right stage.
I think that's absolutely true. Basically, if you think about good practice in forms and all the examples that we're going to give, the vast majority are mainstream usability and they will be benefiting every single user. But because people have impairments, which means they have more extreme needs in certain areas, it will disproportionately help this group. So timing, for example, we'll talk a little bit more about time-dependent functionality later on. You need to be more generous than you might otherwise think for the average user. And there's sometimes a conflict between, security and the time that you would give them to complete each stage. So if it's too long, then chunk it up into smaller sections and allow people to save as they go.
Great, thank you. So we're on to mandatory fields. These are the fields that you know that the users need to complete for you to be able to give them the service or information that you require. And a very obvious starting point, and most people will know of this, is making it clear which fields are required, usually by using an asterisk. And because that's the convention, it's often better to do that. But equally, making it clear when you're setting your forms up before you start filling information in. That's the start of this, really. And using an asterisk is the most common way of doing it. The instructions being as upfront as possible, not afterwards or even implied, just very clear. Then we also then have an indicator within the label for each required field. I've pulled up a code here, Robin, that's an example here with a code snippet. Can you just say something about the labels and particularly how this relates to screen readers? Because I think this is a good example where accessibility has a particular requirement at this stage.
Absolutely, yeah. So the asterisk there often isn't coded to be within the label, name, first name, surname, etc. It's just kind of to the side, but it's not actually part of the label. And what we've got here is an example of a screen reader user like myself pulling all the labels in a form up into a list out of context, just like the links that say read more or click here pulled up into a links list out of context don't make any sense to someone like myself. Make sure that the mandatory nature of the form control is added in there with the label so that it's pulled up into that list like that.
Great, thank you. So with optional fields, I think this is, from my understanding, Robin, this is more like, you could do that or you could do this. They sort of slightly contradict each other, I think, but you could state that a field is optional as well as stating that it's required.
I think you probably have an either-or situation here. So if you want to use stars to tell your users that things are mandatory, that's obviously the recognised convention, and it's really important for everybody, not just for people with disabilities, to make sure that you adhere to conventions as much as possible. People with a cognitive impairment would probably rely more on falling back on conventional behaviour and would get more easily confused if you try to do something slightly different. But what we've got here with Wikipedia is where there are so few fields, and you could put stars against those, or what they've done here is just clearly label that one is optional. I haven't actually seen that anywhere else. It's just another way of doing it. I think it's clear. Perhaps you could argue not quite so clear, and it's not following the convention. But if that's the way you want to do it, it's a slightly softer approach rather than saying you must fill this, you must fill that. It's an alternative.
Yeah. Just to point out to anybody that wants to, you can ask questions as we're going along, and this is maybe an example where we're seeing this as an option, This is what's interesting when we're doing this, Robin, is I do think that conventions are very important in the form design generally, aren't they? Then, and there are accessibility reasons for that in terms of people being familiar with what they're expected to do, not giving unusual names or odd descriptions, using the language that people expect rather than whatever you've decided your clever way of doing it is going to be. I think that's the sort of point here, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, there was a time with the web where people wanted to really experiment and do things in a completely wacky way. We've moved away from that now. Things are relatively consistent across websites. Let's try and adhere to that as much as possible. And it's not just going to help your disabled customers, but every single user as well.
Great, thank you. I've got a quick question here for you, Robin. Somebody's just asked, which screen reader browser combo do you use and what drives your particular decision?
Well, I use JAWS simply because it outstrips all the other screen readers in a sort of a professional productivity role. So in Office, you really need to use JAWS, for example, to handle tables and things well. But on the internet, and I use Internet Explorer and I use Firefox, on the internet, though, you don't have to use JAWS. So if you're a developer and you want to test some of the things that we're going to be talking about with a screen reader, then don't get JAWS for £900. Get NVDA, which stands for Non-Visual Desktop Access. Just search for NVDA. I think it's -project.org. And that screen reader has exactly the same keystrokes as JAWS and will say exactly the same things as JAWS 95% of the time, maybe 98% of the time, in both IE and Firefox. I also use VoiceOver on OS X and on iOS as well.
Great, thank you. Somebody just mentioned I've experienced some people leaving off all indications of what's required as a way to get users to enter as much information as possible. We're going to come in a moment to deliberately trying to trick people. We're obviously not going to advocate that, but we will come to that in a moment. So yes. There's another question here, Robin. Would using required instead of an asterisk be easier? Would the screen reader understand the character? I think we've got an example of that in a moment, haven't we? Talking about how the screen reader would use the asterisk. What it would read to you.
Yeah, don't worry about, I would probably say stick with conventions. Don't worry about whether it's going to read the star out or not. It always will. There are different verbosity settings so that when I'm reading some text, I don't hear every comma and full stop, but the star always is. And that probably is for the reasons that we see here, like the fact that you need to have it spoken to you when working through forms.
Great, thank you. So, next slide. Now we're talking here about the positioning of labels. Make sure that labels are positioned to the right of the form. When we were talking about this, Robin, I said, doesn't it do this automatically? But you had a particular reason why, when a screen reader is looking to find particular information, it would look for information to be in a particular place. So I've got a checklist here with 7 or 8 choices. All of the checklists, all of the clickable buttons have the information to the right of it. That's a convention, of course. But there was a particular thing you were saying about the software and how it looks for the answers.
Yeah, so it's really important to properly associate labels with the form control. So you should, we'll come on to this a little bit later on, but you shouldn't just be forced to click the checkbox. You should be able to click the label or the radio button. You should be able to click the label as well. It gives you a much bigger clickable area. Now, when you do that, when you properly associate labels, then they will automatically be found by a screen reader and spoken out when you tab onto them. If you don't properly associate, then the screen reader will go out and look for the label and try and guess. Now, for checkboxes and radio buttons, that's always to the right of the form control because that's convention. If you stick to that convention, then as I tab through this set of checkboxes, it will say checkbox checked and then the text label, and that's all hunky-dory. But if you don't, if you put them above or to the left, then because a screen reader is looking for them, for radio buttons and checkboxes, it's looking to the right or below. For edit boxes and other controls like that, it will look to the left or above, or combo boxes, things like that. And so if you put it in a non-conventional place, or you don't put it close enough, maybe they're all right aligned and there's a huge gap between the checkbox and its label, then a screen reader user might hear the wrong checkbox label spoken out, think the checkbox is for something else, and tick the wrong thing. So please do associate them properly with form controls, and we'll look at that a little bit later on. But if you don't, then make sure that again, it's all about adhering to convention, in this case, to the right-hand side of a checkbox or a radio button.
Great, thank you. Moving on to formats, this is another little part of just adding information that enables the user to understand what you want from them. If you want the data in a particular format, then tell the user. Here's an example of saying with the date of birth that you want it in the day, then the month, and the year. And of course, for those of us in the UK, we expect it to be in that order, but if you start using American sites, often they reverse some of those. So, and then there's some code that's been picked out here. Robin, this is just adding a label to the form, as far as I understand. I'm not the code person, just to let you know.
Yeah, I mean, we probably don't need to spend too long on this because it's relatively self-explanatory. It's just reminding people that this is very commonly done properly anyway. But if you don't give people that guide, then chances are they're not going to get it right. And it's very important in this global environment to, sometimes you might not even be aware of where the website is located globally. So it's very important to give people a very clear steer as to what the format is you want them to enter the data in.
Okay, great. Next one, looking at some use of language. This is what we were mentioning about people deliberately. More often than not, I think our experience is people are deliberately trying to trick you, almost to give you fewer choices than you want at that point, or to hide something from you. Neville's already used the phrase dark pattern. You've obviously picked up about this. There's a website, if you haven't seen it, called darkpatterns.org, which is a compendium of lots of different bad practice, lots of different tricks, lots of different examples of people trying to take you around a loop that you don't necessarily want to go. One very obvious one that a lot of people experience is when you're booking an aeroplane ticket and you've automatically been given insurance and an upgrade on the baggage allowance and so on. Those sorts of things and practice within the forms, they're bad practice broadly, but in terms of accessibility, they can cause all sorts of issues for people who are trying to use your forms and end up in a loop that they can't get out of, or don't expect a particular piece of information to be requested at a certain time. I mean, Robin, have you ever had an experience of anything like this? Does it ring any bells?
For me, forms can be very confusing even as a power user. So half the time I'm not sure whether the confusion or the ambiguity I'm experiencing is because they're poorly labelled, poorly structured, not complying with some of the things that we're going to cover in these slides, or because they're being purposefully obtuse. So I don't know. But yeah, go and have a look at the Dark Patterns website. Here on this slide, we've got an example of obtuse language. The basic premise is that if you're trying to obfuscate if you're trying to be clever and get them to do something that they might not otherwise do, that can be very confusing and frustrating and annoying for every user, and for disabled users it could be a showstopper. So if you want, if it's a commercial fulfillment process that you've got here, for example, then you might actually lose custom by making it too confusing for disabled users.
Okay, great, thank you. And final one here, just in the section around instructions. We were talking about this in terms of the stepping stone process through the design of the form, and having a clear stage. In many cases with forms, you've put quite a lot of information in. You just want to have it checked before you press submit. This is an example from Amazon that we'll all be familiar with. It summarizes what you're about to click to say buy now. It tells you which payment method you're using, tells you where it's going to be delivered, tells you what you've purchased, it tells you how much you're going to pay. That summary page we're very familiar with that on e-commerce, of course, but it could quite well be applicable in lots of other settings as well. I think we were talking about examples where you submit personal information in details when doing a tax return, for example. And I think this is really about just making sure people understand what they've committed to before they press the button. I think that's the point, isn't it?
Absolutely. And in that summary, if you can segment up that page visually or ideally from a coding point of view as well, with different headings so that they can readily see the chunked up, the segmented information. They can see that this bit was about the personal information they gave, the next bit was about, I don't know, when, you know, their billing address or whatever it might be. That's really, really important. And this final stage is a very useful point at which they can go back. You know, that the error rate amongst people who have impairments might be higher. So to be able to have this stage where they can spot an error that they didn't realize they'd done and go back is incredibly important.
Okay, great. I've got a question for you, Robin, coming in. I'm from Jonathan. Have you got any views on HTML5 form data types and screen reader accessibility? I know we're going to cover that a little bit. This is a more general comment, I think.
There isn't a direct. There aren't any issues from an accessibility point of view, and they are something that we would advocate using, again, from a normal usability and from an accessibility point of view. And yes, we're going to cover those a little bit later on.
Okay, great. Because we had a slightly disrupted start, I'm just going to ask a question of you, all the people on the call, about how experienced you are in your use of creating forms. I'd like to know how experienced you are from I've never designed a form before through to I'm a form ninja. We're expecting quite a broad spectrum. We've obviously got your registration details and so on, but we don't want to either under or over emphasize particular technical issues. The questions coming in do appear to suggest that you have some knowledge of code. That was certainly a question that we had when we were planning this. And then I think what we're hoping to do is also pitch this in a level that when you want to ask questions, please feel comfortable to ask them at any level. That's the other point we can deal with. So great. I've got most of you filled the form in already. Quick catch up if you can do for another few seconds, 10 seconds, and we'll see if we can get to close to 100% of you. And then I can close the poll and show you the results, and we can you'll see that most of the people are coming in as I'm a form improver, which is between a beginner and a ninja. So if I share the results with you now, you can see 57% of people are saying they're a form improver. There are currently close to 60 people who filled that poll in. So I think we got it about the right level, right, Robin? That's the good news. Even though we started late and we had our technical issues, I think we've got the material at the right level, which is a
brilliant.
Good point.
Don't forget to close the poll.
Right. We'll do that now. Right. So moving on to our next section, we're talking about instructions and being clear what you tell the user in terms of what you're asking for. And I get part of that, but a significant part of it for some people is really tell the user what went wrong when something doesn't work. And I think we've all experienced that, where we've been trying to fill a form in, pressed submit, it hasn't gone through for some reason, and it's not very clear why, and it's not very clear what we're meant to be doing about it. We're going to mention a couple of things, the messaging and the inline notifications. There will be a little bit of discussion about ARIA. And if you don't know what ARIA is, don't worry, we'll talk about that at the time. And then we're talking about timeouts and segmentation of your survey, and a little bit of a look at Captcha, which can be the final point at which people fall before filling in and buying something from you or requesting information. So the first one I'm looking at is inline notifications. We have to start by understanding that people will make mistakes. And I've got an example up here where I've made a mistake in logging into this page. And it says, welcome to this site, which it probably said before. It says login name and an empty box with a little red star next to it, password and an empty box and a little red star next to it, and forgotten your password. And those were all there before I got it wrong, and they haven't changed at all, really. The little red star is the only indication that I've got to fill those things in. And that's the example of why we think we need to fix this better. You have to talk to people in a very clear way about the mistakes they've made and how they can put it right. So make sure users know what went wrong and how to fix it. It's pretty straightforward. Just add some code in to say that this field is required. As the example we're pulling up here, the error has been made. A red box has come up with a circle's come up with a white cross in it saying this is incorrect. Somebody's managed to get through this form without filling any of these in at the moment. but this field is required underneath. It's an easy way of just giving people a sense that there are some instructions here that they need to follow. And this field.
So we would advocate the best practice approach being to have these inline notifications, ideally make them smart error messages as well. So if you put in the wrong format, you haven't put in an email address, you didn't have the @ sign in there or something, that it would say, incorrect email address format or something like that, rather than just the cross. We would also advocate having a error message at the top to tell people that there are error messages further down the form, particularly when it's a lengthy form, because a magnification user who only sees a tiny portion of the page will be coming down from the top. And because the form controls are scattered, if there's only a sort of a red cross and perhaps not a big red box around each one, then they might well miss those in sort of roaming around the form, and they might wonder why it hasn't been submitted successfully. But if you have a big error message at the top, then that will help them, and it'll tell them that yes, they have to look for something within the form. And for a screen reader user like myself as well, we have a very linear process of going down through it. So it would be nice to say, 7 errors have been made. So it tells us, how many to expect as we work our way down through the form as well.
Yeah, I'd just point out, somebody's pointed out the asterisk that's referenced in the form, that the image that we're showing, Robin, has got just the fields that haven't been filled, and it's just showing that text underneath the field is required. As Robin's just said then, it would be better to have a message above it saying this is the number of errors, if you could do that, or as required here, that it says the ones that are marked with an asterisk are required. This is slightly redundant unless you can see that message. So this is really just making sure the whole page works for the person, that the page that pops up, in my experience, I find it most confusing when the page doesn't change what it looks like, when something doesn't happen to indicate that you've made a mistake. The other one I really dislike, although I guess the security considerations are often the reason, is it takes out some of the stuff you've put in already. Often you put in passwords, for example. It removes them and you have to put the details back in again, usually on a banking form. But just thinking about that stage in the process and how you're conveying to people what the error is. I've got a question here, Robin. Does it matter whether the inline error is positioned or where it's positioned, i.e. before or after the incorrectly filled field?
It would be ideal if it was within the label element, so it would say first name in brackets required, so that's spoken out as one chunk when a screen reader user is tabbing through, and that's about as proximate as you can get, so magnification users will definitely spot it. So yeah, ideally within the label, as an extended part of the label.
Just to draw attention there to the thing you're saying about the magnification. That's a different form of assistive technology where the screen is enlarged, and very often for magnification software users, it's really about locating things when they've really zoomed in on the page. Got a question here which I don't understand actually, so you're definitely the person who's going to try and answer it. How well do you think the HTML5 native form validation holds up versus JavaScript?
There are issues with both of them, and unfortunately, the assistive technology arena is a very mixed one. There's a mixed bag across the different screen readers, and sorry to keep on going back to screen readers, but we are definitely the most challenging customers that you're trying to include, or make your products as inclusive as possible for. So support for HTML5 elements across the board, and those in particular were better supported by some screen readers than others. JavaScript, just to kind of address this very briefly, do not think that the no script is for disabled people or screen reader users. Absolutely nobody is going to be using the no script content that you'll be putting in alternatives, because if JavaScript wasn't turned on, then the internet would break. So with your JavaScript, ideally source it from JavaScript from accessible libraries. Otherwise, the very specific implementation of JavaScript for error handling that you've coded, check it with NVDA on Internet Explorer or Firefox, check it with VoiceOver on an iDevice, even with TalkBack on Android if you can.
Great, thank you. So our next bit is talking about ARIA. First thing, Robin, is really to explain what ARIA is, please.
So ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, and again, it's us awkward screen reader users mostly who would benefit from it. It's a way of layering extra information, extra functionality on for extra accessibility, really, for certain groups like myself. So if you want to turn your form into a Rolls-Royce form for screen reader users, then you can use ARIA. Here's an example on this page, and we've got another example if you want to proceed on to the next page.
Yeah.
Basically, there's two things, well, there's lots of things you can do, but in this instance, if somebody submitted the page, submitted the form, and it's refreshed the page and brought up errors, then the main message, which says there are 7 errors, blah, 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 can be wrapped in a live region in an ARIA alert, and it will automatically be spoken out. You can also do it with live, Ajaxy type forms where things are happening. If you go to Google, they're very good with their ARIA live alerts. As you tab out of a field and an error message comes up saying, incorrect email address or something, that's also spoken out automatically. Even when you're putting in a search term, you can get these results that drop down, giving you common searches. Those are all spoken because of ARIA. So it's just an extra. I mean, Google are very good at kind of applying ARIA to the different things that they do, including the standard Gmail webmail interface, and they also offer a more basic one, using a secret hidden link at the top that only screen reader users see, if they're using one of these screen readers that don't support ARIA so well.
Okay, great. Move on to the next section then. Next problem that we see people having to grapple with is Captcha. Robin, tell us a bit about Captcha. It stands for something, I know. I can never remember what.
Completely automated process for telling computers and humans apart.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a catch-22 when it comes to accessibility, because by definition it is not machine readable by anyone, by any machines, any bots. And people using assistive technologies are basically presenting as well that they have the same needs as machine readable content, because they need to be able to take that, read it, and convert it into a different format, whether it's speech output. Well, it's mostly people with a vision impairment who have problems with it, because it's either an obscure code on the screen because optical character recognition isn't able to interpret it, etc., etc. You guys know all the reasons why Captcha is a complete nightmare. So what can you do? Well, current thinking for a long time has been, look, just don't have Captcha on your forms. Everyone hates them. You're going to get quite a big dropout rate if you put Captcha on there. So just deal with spam with a proper spam filtering solution post-submission. ReCAPTCHA that Google have had for a long time and their audio version are better, but by no means ideal. It's still very garbled, both the visually and the audio. I've never been able to interpret the audio code successfully, and I'm obviously the person that they're one of the people that they're aimed at. So there are various other options. So textcapture.com, we've probably mentioned about on other podcasts, other webinars as well. So have a look there. It's not for everyone, and it's probably not bulletproof enough for an enterprise solution. But certainly for people, with a WordPress site who want to stop spam bots from posting comments to their forums, then textcapture.com is absolutely brilliant. It's just a text question, which of these is not an animal, hot, dog, banana, and field or something. And then at the bottom here, we've got no captcha, which is Google brought this out in December on the International Day of Disabled People. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it was a very bizarre thing, and we would encourage you to go and read. Is there a link to the article there?
No, I haven't got a link to it, but it's quite easy to find. Just people Google no captcha.
Yeah,
there's lots of different opinions.
Just Google no. And it's very strange. It allows you to just click on a box that says, I am not a robot. And it does some clever stuff by interpreting your mouse movements as you approach the tick box. For some reason, it works from the keyboard as well, to help people with motor difficulties who need to use a keyboard and can't use a mouse, which to me, I have no idea how they distinguish between someone tabbing to it as a human and someone tabbing to it as a robot. But anyway, it claims to. There's been lots of testing by different accessibility organisations, and broadly speaking, actually, it does work. You can tab to it to hit spacebar on it. It works with screen readers, etc. It's not a checkbox, even though it looks like one. It's something fancy, but it does announce itself as a checkbox using the proper ARIA role attribute. But there are some shortcomings. So it doesn't work with mobile. It doesn't work if you tap on it, maybe because it can't detect how your finger has come up to the screen, if it's a robotic finger or not, like the mouse movement going to click on it. And it doesn't work with JAWS and IE, which is the most common screen reader and web browser combo, although it does work with NVDA and IE that I mentioned about before, and it does work with VoiceOver on Safari and pretty much all the others, but not the most common pair.
Great, thank you. Just a very brief mention here of the testing tools that you can use to check for forms. The Web Accessibility toolbar for Internet Explorer and the Wave toolbar. I'm going to jump on, Robin, because we're running a little bit late. I also want to remind people that you can get because I know people are starting to have to go in the slot that we allowed. There will be a copy of the recording will be shared with everybody of the session, and also all of the slides will be available on slideshare.net afterwards. So if you have missed something, or you do have questions, or there are other things that, because we're running a bit late, that you think you might miss, then be reassured that there will be a recording available afterwards. Okay, we're going on to a new area, looking at mobile, and there are lots of reasons why mobile it throws up more problems, maybe even bigger problems than working and thinking about desktop. Working on a small screen, thinking about people trying to check forms use their forms on a sunny day and trying to read the screen. There's issues around the font choices and the color contrast and the need to avoid scrolling. Robin, I think you've picked up a couple of issues here in terms of text input. Just as examples, because obviously mobile is such a broad area, but I think we've picked on a couple here around the keyboard entering and so on. Could you just talk a little bit about mobile and then particularly about forms?
Great. So yeah, on the summary that Mark just flagged there, these issues that apply sort of broadly to mobile, and because it's a smaller screen and there are these extreme environments, then every user is temporarily disabled in effect because they're using this device in a much more extreme environment, much smaller screen, etc. So the issues that would benefit people with a vision impairment, a cognitive impairment, etc., will benefit every single user. So the segmentation of forms that we talked about will help people who are viewing it on a much smaller screen and you can fit much less information on, etc. And to that point, as Mark mentioned, so if you are entering text, which 99% of the time you are on a form, if the screen is smaller, don't serve up the wrong keyboard. So if it's just data, if the data is just numerical, as we've got here, then make sure that it doesn't bring up the standard QWERTY keyboard. And is there an example on this screen, or is it on the next one?
So the next one, where we go on to the issues, the control type. We've got three different types of issues to show. Where, for example, the one I've just pulled up is asking you for a number, but is pulling up the full QWERTY keyboard. Whereas obviously if it's a telephone number and it identified as a telephone, it would pull up the telephone keyboard. But making sure the right number format is pulled up. And that's a coding question, as I understand it, Robin, in terms of just making sure that the form is clear what type of information it's expecting.
Absolutely. So this is referring to what someone was saying earlier about HTML5 control types. And yes, please do. Not every browser supports it, but because it's a browser-specific thing, then it's not to do with how sophisticated your screen reader is, etc. So very, very beneficial. And because if a browser doesn't support it, then it will gracefully degrade back to, giving you a full keyboard, which isn't ideal. But yeah, so use them as much as possible. There's absolutely no downside, and there's only upside.
Great. Second issue we're looking at here is using the right format. We've got an example from Facebook that asks you for your birthday. but could be a drop-down menu or some other custom data input field. And again, this is quite common, and on a small screen, obviously makes it much harder, much more likely that you'll do it wrong, I guess, is the point, isn't it?
Yeah, so there are various pickers and things that you have in mobile, equivalent to a combo box or a multi-select, and you could choose to use those, or if it's in this case a birthday, which is numerical again, then maybe you would just bring up the number keyboard, the number keypad. Definitely not the full QWERTY as we see here.
Great. And a final example, really, of this example is mostly about getting the space right to actually be able to tappable space right, to be able to put the right thing in, and where forms haven't been designed to work well on a phone size screen, then it's often easy to hit the wrong button and find yourself going backwards and forwards trying to put the right information in. The one on the left has lots of different stuff very close to each other. The one on the right is very clear, and a number of checkboxes which are very easy to hit the right one. I mean, this is a big accessibility issue, I think, isn't it, Robin, about the tappable space?
Absolutely, because it's not just to do with, you often hear people saying they've got sausage fingers and, they tap the wrong thing. So it helps those people as well. But it helps everyone who is juggling their phone while they're, using their other hand to do something else. The bigger the area, the less proximate they are with, more spacing between them, the less chance there is that somebody's going to hit the wrong one. And obviously, if someone's got a fine motor control difficulty, then they need that consideration as well, regardless of how careful they're being.
Great, thank you. So, final part of this really is that HTML5. We've mentioned HTML5. Clearly, this has particular features that people could be using in their forms.
Yeah, we've pretty much covered this. Use HTML5 as much as possible. I think it's safe to say that there's not really any aspect, perhaps except the canvas. The canvas is like HTML5's answer to Flash or something like that. It's what you would use when you haven't been able to create the effect or the functionality that you want in another way, a la the recent Flipboard web implementation. To get that very notable Flipboard effect, they resorted to Canvas, and they're having to layer on accessibility as a completely separate project almost, and that's not that's undesirable from a dev point of view, and in this case from a PR point of view, because they haven't done that bit of work yet before launch. So a lot of people who are who need accessibility in Flipboard are very upset. So use HTML5 as much as possible, because apart from Canvas, which can be made accessible but takes a lot of effort, you pretty much get accessibility out of the box if you stick with HTML5.
Great. Got a question here, which something's popped up on the screen that we didn't talk to actually, was about why is scrolling bad on a mobile when using a form? I don't know whether that's quite what you meant, but
I kind of alluded to it. It's not bad in as much as you should try and avoid it at all costs and create all your pages so that they don't have to scroll at all. That's not what we're saying. But from a motor point of view, if you can avoid excessive scrolling, either in pages or in forms, that's really good. It also means that in the case of pages, you're limiting your copy, which is good for people with literacy difficulties. With web, they say that you should halve the content from, if you're taking something from a print thing to online, you should halve the length of all text. To go to mobile, it's like a third, or you halve it again almost to make it a quarter. So if you're really very ruthless in that, then there'll be less content to get through, and it'll help people who find scrolling difficult. And with forms, if you can chunk it up and just use the next button as much as possible so that there isn't excessive scrolling, then it's also going to help people for whom it takes them a very long time to fill it out, and they might need to save their progress and come back, for example.
And I guess this is important in wireframing stage, isn't it? This is really about getting this right more or less from the start, of thinking this through, because you've got a number of screens that people are going to go through, and obviously if you end up chunking it into 10 or 11 screens, then again you've got a challenge in people following all that process all the way through, being clear where they are in the process, getting the instructions right each time. But so this really does illustrate about thinking about this right from the start, clarifying what's the most important information that we need, what are the most important things that the user wants to tell us at each stage, rather than endless forms that are filled with lots of detail that we're not necessarily going to use, just we might capture it at that point just because we can.
Yeah, I mean, if we had to sum up the mobile section, which, it seems quite brief here, but basically all of the other things still apply and are actually even more essential, even more important to implement when it comes to mobile. So this mobile section is pretty much saying everything before is really, really important for mobile, plus these, examples that are peculiarly interesting or applicable to mobile.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, we're going to, that's the end of the session, and then we're going to look specifically at questions now. If you have any questions, please let me know. I've got a couple here that I'm going to go through. I'm also going to want to open up a final poll, just to summarise, really, to see what you think are going to be the bits that you're going to be most relevant to you in terms of your work. I can see a spelling mistake on here as well, actually. So is it the fact that you need to sort out clear instructions? Is it the fact that you need to look at your error messages? You can tick any of these that apply. Is Captcha going to be something that you're going to go away and think about, or are there other issues that have come up that you think will be useful? And if you have got other issues, then please mention them in the questions. It will be interesting to see what you think are going to be the takeaways or the stuff that you're going to be taking into your next piece of work. Somebody's mentioned that they want to know that they'll be putting ARIA into their next piece of work, and looking more at that, I guess, and finding out more. The main answers, I can see the answers coming up live at the moment, mainly error messaging, mobile issues, less so about Captcha, interestingly. I don't know whether that means that you already have that sorted, or that's just something that you're not certain is going to be relevant. But moving on to questions, I'll leave that poll up there for a while, because things might come up in the questions. Robin, have you got any experience or knowledge of any of the sort of form building software that is out there? I've been asked that a couple of times as we go through, and I don't know whether you know of anything about the form software. There's Gravity Forms, Drupal, Web Forms, those sorts of things. I've used Gravity Forms in WordPress, but I don't have a view of it in terms of accessibility. It definitely is accessible enough for us to use.
Yeah, both Gravity and the Drupal form builder, those are the ones that I've had experience with, and I know that those platforms themselves have relatively good accessibility credentials, or at least potential, if you do things in a correctly, and they certainly don't lock out accessibility. So they are both very popular platforms, and their form building functionality doesn't preclude any of the stuff that we covered here. So I don't think that you will find it difficult to implement any of the things that we talked about if you use those two. You just have to make sure that you do them. I don't know about any others, to be honest.
Okay. I have a couple of interesting points here, and I think this something that isn't in my poll, actually, which I think is something I've picked up from preparing all of this materials, is what you've called segmentation, Robin. Putting the information into chunks and making the form work in a way that's usable at each stage, and maybe not making sure there's not too much of it, but equally that it's the right information. I think that's a challenge. Any design process, isn't it, that you bring it down to the minimum useful for everybody.
Yeah, and if there has to be a lot, like on the summary page, as we saw with Amazon there, then segment it with headings, segment it with a shaded, slightly grey background to each section, so that people can see where one section ends and the next one starts as well. That sort of thing. Try and sort of separate. Good use of white space as well really aids. We haven't talked much about dyslexia, but that decent default font size, good color contrast, avoiding a sans serif font. I mentioned about a good choice of color of font style as well earlier. Will help people with dyslexia greatly, and everybody else. But separating out those elements so that there's good use of white space in between all of the form controls will help people with dyslexia and literacy difficulties, people with vision impairments, and those people with sausage fingers who, if they're too close together. So there are so many overlaps here, and what you'll end up with are forms that are just more easy to use for everybody. Great,
thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. That's the end of the presentation. I'll just show you the poll, which has the majority of people saying that they're going to be looking at checking the instructions on this site, dealing with error messaging, and looking at what it means on mobile. And obviously that covered a lot of stuff. So we've just done a very broad area there, but I do hope that you found it useful. The slides will be available on SlideShare. We'll circulate a link with that. The video will be available on YouTube and will be captioned. We can't do live captions, or we don't do live captions. We do captions afterwards. So if anybody wants to share that with someone who would need captions, then it will be done. And another top tip in here, somebody just saying about avoiding screen refreshes for dependent fields. So that clearly, we've mentioned lots of little parts of that, and there are lots of details there. There are lots of places to look for help with this sort of stuff. So I hope you found it useful as a broad overview. Obviously, if there's any questions that you have about anything more detailed, please do let us know. Get in touch with us. Robin's email address is on the screen now, robin.christopherson@abilitynet.org.uk. You can give us a call at AbilityNet to talk about any of these issues raised today. And the next 2 webinars that we have up, we have 2 coming up in March. One is dealing with RSI in the workplace, relating to our workplace services, and accessible apps, designing accessible apps. As a case study, we're going to be talking to Barclays. We've just accredited their mobile banking app for their customers, and that's fully accessible. And we'll be talking about what they did and how they did it, and some experience from the developer side about how it's changed their processes and the sorts of implications that they've picked up and now started rolling into the next projects that they're working on.